this organization. Recognizing the fact that our webinar, in many cases, will occur on the traditional territories of the First Peoples, we would like to acknowledge this as a sign of recognition and respect. This statement supports the protocol that is customary when one First Nation and another meet on or within the traditional territory of a First Nation. National Council of Jewish Women of Canada has been an ongoing organization in Canada since 1897. Our mandate is to further human welfare locally, nationally, and internationally through an integrated program of education, service, and social action. We hope this webinar with our world-renowned journalists will help us learn why they would choose to risk their lives to tell the story. Often finding themselves in dangerous positions, knowing many of their colleagues have been detained, jailed, and even killed for the information they share. These courageous individuals continue their work, often at personal risk and with great determination. We hope today's program will help us learn about the journalists' challenges and perhaps find out how we can advocate for them. Thank you to our sponsors, the Globe and Mail, Danielle Martin from the Martin Group of Scotia Wealth Management, the Raoul Wallenberg Center, and our marketers extraordinaire, Women Ambassadors Forum. Thank you, Ingrid. We are honored to have Peter Donolo as the moderator of our panel. Peter is one of Canada's most experienced communications strategists and a veteran advisor to leaders in corporate Canada and at all three levels of government. Peter is a member of the board of directors of Journalists for Human Rights. All of you, please keep muted throughout the webinar. If you have questions to pose, please type your questions using the chat tab at any time. There will be time to address a selection of your questions in the latter part of the webinar. Without further ado, Peter. Peter, you're muted.
There we go. Thank you very much, Debbie. And it's great to be with you today. And it's wonderful to have so many people tuning in to this important subject. I'm the one, like they used to say in Sesame Street, I'm the one thing that isn't like the others in this group today. I'm the one non-working journalist who's going to preside over this panel or moderate the panel of really outstanding Canadian and American journalists to talk about really the most pressing issue of our times, which is respect for human rights from a journalistic angle. It's very timely that this panel takes place just really 4 days after the Nobel Committee bestowed the Nobel Peace Prize on two working journalists, Maria Ressa of the Philippines and Dmitry Muratov of Russia, who both embody the fearlessness of contemporary human rights journalism in the context of what are supposed to be two democratic countries that have become increasingly authoritarian in recent years, and that really are predatory when it comes to the coverage of human rights and of news in their own countries. These are two people who place their own lives on the line every day in reporting in their own countries, and they symbolize so much of the brave work that's being done around the world. So in a sense, we live in a very strange period in which there's never been a greater prevalence of reporting on human rights. Certainly, in history's darkest eras, we never had this kind of wide scale, detailed, instantaneous reporting on human rights. But at the same time, so many of these journalists are under direct life and death threat in reporting the news. And it happens in a context in which the public doesn't always understand or doesn't always acknowledge the importance of the news or see it as a call to action for change, even in the countries that are affected. So I want to talk about that today with this really distinguished panel of really top drawer journalists that we have, and I'll introduce them by turn, and then we'll ask them to say a few words. First off is Susan Shira, who is currently the editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project in the United States, which is a really innovative and remarkable project that reports, a cooperative in essence, that reports on the criminal justice system in the US. And while not affiliated with a particular newspaper or media outlet, has affected tremendous and important changes in the criminal justice system in the US. So it's an interesting, innovative concept, much like the cooperatives that we've seen unveil the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers in recent days, and perhaps a new direction in journalism and a new direction in reporting human rights. But this is only the latest of Susan Shira's long career in journalism. She spent almost 4 decades with the New York Times in virtually every capacity, including heading up their foreign coverage, as well as having been a foreign correspondent herself, heading up their foreign coverage in those very difficult years after 9/11. She was part of the Pulitzer Prize winning team that exposed the Harvey Weinstein sexual abuse scandals, and again has been to the front line of expanding coverage of human rights, most recently while she was at the Times on gender coverage. So really a terrific asset. And Susan is going to be coming to us from New York City. Doug Saunders, many of you will know, has had a 25-year association with the Globe and Mail newspaper. He is a recipient of, I think, 5 National Newspaper Awards. He is currently based in Berlin, although he comes to us today from Luxembourg, I think. Doug has covered everything from the Arab Spring to the civil unrest and the civil war in Ukraine. His coverage of Europe. He's actually in Schengen now, which is the home of the treaty that brought the common currency to Europe a couple of decades ago. His understanding of Europe, of the European, the complex but generally positive European developments over the post-war is really a special asset to readers of the Globe and Mail. And he's also written a couple of really important books, particularly The Myth of the Muslim Tide, which is just it's a total and authoritative pushback to the anti-Muslim hysteria that was so prevalent in our societies just a few years ago, and unfortunately still gets too much attention. So really, his knowledge of the migration of people, in particular, both forced and opportunistic, is a special asset in this globalized context we deal with. And finally, David Shribman, who is another. It seems all the Americans here are Pulitzer Prize winners. Another Pulitzer Prize winner from his time at the Boston Globe, I understand, has been a senior journalist with from the New York Times to the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, was the executive editor of the Pittsburgh Post Gazette, and it was he who came up with that incredible headline the morning after the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh 3 years ago, about with the Kaddish headline that I don't think anyone had ever seen on the front page of an American newspaper, North American newspaper before. That was very moving and summed everything up. David is also a rare American political journalist and foreign policy expert who actually knows about and understands Canada, and which often seems to be the most exotic country for American journalists and foreign policy experts. And that is, I guess, I understand he's a dual Canadian American citizen, and he's actually associated now teaching at the Max Bell School at McGill University in Montreal, although he's coming to us today from Pittsburgh. So
I'll be in Montreal on Thursday.
There you go. So that's our panel, folks, and it's a powerhouse. I want to just open it up immediately to them to take a little bit of time to elaborate on individually. We'll start with Susan, and then go to Doug and David. We'll do this strictly in alphabetical order, and that is on the developments over human rights developments over the last 30 years. Too often it can seem like you can get super despondent just reading the paper when the coverage of human rights, not just abroad, but I mean, even in our own continent, when you have a former president who referred to the media as enemies of the people. It can be a difficult situation. I was in government in the 1990s, and it seemed then that the world was just the brighter tomorrow was beckoning. The Iron Curtain come down, of course, the Berlin Wall come down. Most of the countries in South and Central America were transitioning to democracy. You had apartheid was in the dust heap in South Africa. You had major movements towards peace with the negotiations, the Oslo Accords in the Middle East, and then it all turned into sand in our hands, running through the fingers of our hands, and that positive period is hard to remember now that we've been in such a difficult 20 years. I'm going to ask our folks to, of course, world history certainly predates the last 20 years. And these journalists have been active on that front in their entire career. So I'm going to ask each of them to take us on a bit of a journey through their eyes over their careers in human rights, in covering human rights, and covering the human condition, which is really what it's about, and to kind of set the stage for the rest of the discussion today. So we'll start with you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was a very helpful scene setter. I know what you mean about despair. I think this has been a time where we're really trying to look for hope, as we still contend with the pandemic. And what I would say is that this is an urgent and terrifying time to be a journalist of any nationality. And I think that one of the things that I've seen in a career that where I've spent a lot of my care and time and energy thinking about international affairs, we used to think that a war zone was, the most dangerous place for a journalist. And heaven knows, tragically, we've seen a great deal of loss, as the United States in particular embarked on its forever wars, starting with 9/11. And the sequelae of that is something I've had, harrowing personal experience with, trying to gauge, how to help people stay as safe as they could while bearing witness to things that we felt the world needed to know. And so we've had a terrifying reminder of that recently with Afghanistan. I don't need to elaborate for this audience, but I know that your group, Peter, and many others, including my former colleagues at the New York Times, have spent sleepless weeks and months attempting to evacuate from Afghanistan in the face of the Taliban turnover. Afghans who risked a great deal to cooperate with, in my case, Americans, but whomever, to bring the news, to translate, to arrange interviews, to be crucial cultural guides, and to help protect journalists working in that country. And the level of desperation and fear as people, tried and failed to evacuate has been harrowing for all of us to witness, and is just the latest example. I mean, in Afghanistan, since 2001, the Committee to Protect Journalists, on whose board I'm honored to serve, has kept a kind of running tally. At least 64 journalists are killed in Afghanistan, countless more injured or psychologically injured, which is another issue. So Afghanistan, I think, is the example of a place where we have what we've seen as a kind of conventional attack on journalists. And we've seen women, of course, removed from the journalistic scene in Afghanistan so that they cannot chronicle what is happening to the role of women in Afghanistan, as we've seen traditional Afghan journalists intimidated away from doing that, which is kind of theme 2 in my survey here, which is that you astutely noticed, that perhaps we thought in the 90s with the fall of the Berlin Wall and what we thought was a kind of moment for democracy. And instead, we've seen a really crushing success of authoritarian governments. all around the world, we see governments that have successfully intimidated, imprisoned, prosecuted, and driven out of business journalists who tried to write the truth. And, one of the most recent examples of that is Hong Kong. We know what went on in China, but it is truly striking to see how a vibrant, independent press serving a citizenry that was up in arms about the gradual tightening of the Chinese grip on Hong Kong be decimated. And something like Apple Daily, which has been driven out of business and its editor-in-chief imprisoned, and several key journalists there imprisoned under the newly harsh sedition laws that essentially make any kind of freedom of expression an act of treason. And so I think Hong Kong is an exhibit A of how a place that had a very vibrant and feisty press can be shut down and intimidated. And my colleagues and others who report from there say that now journalists are practicing self-censorship for survival. And then another example I think that is very important is how a state that cannot protect journalists, and here I look at Mexico, a place where countless journalists have been killed because they dared to report on drug cartels, or simply because they were caught in drug wars or corrupt police crackdowns. And I think that's another very sobering warning statement of what happens when you have a government that will not or cannot really exert control over segments of its territory, and journalists become the victims. And any attempt to point out the failures either of the state or the out-of-state actors like drug cartels results in deaths. Finally, I have to speak about my own country, which, as you alluded to, if you have a president of the United States who openly calls journalists enemies of the people and encourages and cites attacks at rallies that were held, and as part of a poisonous political polarization in this country, you have countless examples of journalists who are attacked by mobs, who were injured, who were threatened. You have the tragic example of the Capital Gazette, where journalists were killed by, essentially a domestic terrorist. I think that it is extremely, extremely frightening to be a journalist. And many of my former colleagues at the New York Times have had, direct personal threats. And this is something that I understand was in the Toronto Star today, but particularly as we've seen the online world grow even more noxious, women, and particularly women of color, have been targeted on places like Twitter or Facebook, and the kind of doxing that is, publishing people's personal addresses, making public information that could allow people to attack you, is another front in this assault on journalists. And why does that matter? As a lifelong journalist and as someone who watched, I'll go back to the war, the New York Times had a shameful episode at the outlet of the war in Iraq, in which it did not adhere to its standards. But I am proud to say that over time, I believe that we and other news organizations, people risked their lives because they were trying to give an accurate picture of what was going on the ground. And that's not true only in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in any country such as Maria Ressa or Dmitry Muratov, where people are trying to portray an honest and nuanced example when the government in charge only wants propaganda. So I will end that here. I just wanted to give a sense of the array of threats and say that I was particularly gratified about the Nobel, because I feel it's a recognition that we are under assault, and that it's not just individual journalists who are victims, but society's ability to be informed and make informed decisions based on people who will go places and tell them what those in power do not want them to hear.
Excellent. Doug.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Susan, for setting the context so well. I think things definitely have changed during the quarter century that I've been in this trade at this level. And the big change is not that there never were people who were out to kill or imprison or silence journalists. There always were, but I think it's fair to say that generally when I was starting out, the places where that was happening were generally dictatorships or authoritarian regimes. And the people they targeted, were journalists who were doing something that was a direct threat to the regime, exposing their most serious crimes and things like that. What's changed, and we can talk a little bit about why I think that's changed, is that it's no longer just those places. It's no longer just dictatorships that seek to silence journalists. And in fact, and it's not just journalists who are directly threatening to the regime. Let me give you an example. One good example would be Maria Ressa, the Filipina journalist who's just shared the Nobel Peace Prize, very justifiably, who faces prison for having simply reported on a businesswoman who was probably friendly with the strongman president of the Philippines, but was simply would have lost some money possibly because of this story. But let me give you another example who might not be as well known in Canada or the United States, which is a young journalist named Siddique Kapan, who went to a remote province of his country to cover an ugly case involving the gang rape and subsequent murder of a young woman. And he never got to report on the story. On his way there, he was picked up and arrested and thrown in jail. This was in October of last year, of 2020. And given the vague charges of disrupting the peace, which later, as he sat in prison for months, in jail, I should say, for months and months, was upped to accusations of sedition and a vague law known as unlawful activities, which was basically a law designed to anything that the authorities deem is unlawful because it threatens the country in some way can be used, what should be an unconstitutional law. What made this shocking to me is this took place in India, the world's largest democracy. And I should say Mr. Kapan is still in jail a year later, still hasn't really formally been charged, but they're still saying they're going to charge him with sedition for going and reporting on a rape and murder. And again, he was not doing reporting that's going to threaten the state in a direct way, you could say. The best guess is that he was doing reporting that was going to make the particular state that he was covering, Uttar Pradesh, look bad. And that he was from an ethnic group who are frequently targeted by this government. It's a lot like that case of Maria Ressa, who again was just doing ordinary reporting of truthful things about that makes somebody look bad. And it does bring to mind, like you said, the erstwhile president of the United States referring to reporters as enemies of the people. It's a targeting of people for just doing a particular job. And I should say, before we move on, and we can discuss this longer later, that my half-baked thought as to why it's now democratic elected governments that are doing this to reporters just for doing reporting has something to do with a positive development of the last 25 years, which is the democratization of journalists. When I started out, journalism was something like a pseudo profession. It was an elite guild that was hard to get into, and there were limited places you could get printed. And as a consequence, journalists were a little bit protected and a little bit seen as removed from normal life. Now, what we've seen in the last 25 years, of course, with the rise of social media outlets and so on, with all the good and bad things about that, is the fact that journalism has become an unskilled trade that anybody can do. It doesn't mean anybody can do it well, but that anybody could be a journalist. Anybody could potentially be a good journalist and do good reporting. And the perception of journalism by regimes, including democratic ones, and by leaders, suddenly is not as a technical profession, but as a reflex of democracy, as a democratic act that people do. And that is threatening to people who want to remain in power using democratic or pseudo-democratic means, that anybody, just by doing reporting. So I think the shift of threats has shifted from specific special journalists who threaten regimes to the act of reporting itself, to any act of reporting by any citizen that could embarrass somebody who's in power, or the friends of somebody who's in power. And this worries me. This does suggest tools for fighting this, and maybe we can discuss that, but it also suggests that it's a very different and wider threat now happening in countries that we considered some of the safest places to act as a journalist. Places like the Philippines and India and the countries of Central Europe, places like Hungary, Russia, of course, where suddenly being a journalist is very dangerous. Maybe not always getting killed, but getting locked up in jail without a charge for a year, like both Ms. Reza and Mr. Kapan. So that's how I see the current state of play.
Okay, excellent. David.
Well, you two have left me little to say, but let me just say that for many years, I was the chair of the Elijah Parish Lovejoy Award Committee, which is given by Colby College every year to a journalist for courage. Elijah Parish Lovejoy was a valedictorian of his class at Colby College. It wasn't such a big deal because there were only 4 members of that class that year. But he was a crusading American journalist who was killed in Alton, Illinois, when a pro-slavery mob destroyed his press and killed him. And for many years, we would give this award to people who were kind of crusaders for human rights in America, for like civil rights, or for people who unearthed unusual and difficult things about American poverty, or this sort of thing. This year, the committee awarded to 8 intrepid and talented journalists who were subjected to the American government's subpoena of records related to leak investigations. Those reporters' phone records were secretly seized in 2017 by the Department of Justice in an effort to identify and to silence their sources. So I'm talking about human rights violations involving journalists in a country where the very first amendment to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, speaks about the freedom of the press, and where even more fundamentally than the fact that it is the First Amendment, it's the same amendment that includes freedom of religion. So the founders in 1791, when they came up with this amendment, saw journalists and preachers, religion and journalism, on the same plane. And I think we three have taken great comfort from that, and great succor from that, and great support from that. But I think that these press rights are under siege, even in my own country, one of my 2 countries, actually. I'm a dual citizen, as Peter mentioned. But it's a very, very serious problem. Now, I'll be the third of the 3 to mention the phrase enemies of the people, and to remind all of you that that phrase came from the French Revolution and was employed by Stalin in the Soviet Union. Stalin was not a known supporter of human rights, as we know. We saw on January 6th people running around the US Capitol holding, scrawling "murder the media" on the walls of the United States Capitol. We saw someone affiliated with an American publication, Jamal Khashoggi, murdered and dismembered. He was a Saudi dissident, of course. Mr. Trump has turned most of our assumptions on their heads. For nearly a half century in journalism, as a hometown and cub reporter to a national political correspondent to Metro Daily executive editor, and now my happiest incarnation as a contributing columnist to the Globe and Mail. I've navigated with the aid of a newspaperman's North Star, the conviction that there's such a thing as objective truth that can be discovered and delivered through dispassionate hard work and passionate good faith, that the product of that effort, if thoroughly documented, would be accepted as the truth. Now, Mr. Trump turned all of that on its head. Now, why is this important? Well, the human story is replete with examples of moments when the truth was traduced or when the truth was obscured. And these human rights violations are terrible because the victims of these are human, but the fact that they're journalists is not insignificant because the role of the journalist is to unearth the truth. And here are a couple of examples when the truth was really important. How the battleship Maine was sunk in 1898, which began the War of 1898, sometimes called the Spanish-American War. The trumped-up conspiracy surrounding the 1933 burning of the Reichstag that led to the brutal suppression of civil liberties shortly after the Nazis took power in Germany. The false contention that the U-2 reconnaissance plane flown by Francis Gary Powers in 1960 wasn't engaged in espionage over the Soviet Union, when in fact it was. The misleading claims about the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin episode that drew the United States deeper into Vietnam. The repeated obfuscations of the 1970s Watergate scandal. Bill Clinton's denials of his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. The false belief that contributed to by the New York Times, as Susan mentioned quite poignantly, that Saddam Hussein harbored weapons of mass destruction. The fact that the questions about the truth are questions about huge historical issues is why this is of important moment. Now, in my own country, I guess in one of my two countries, the atmosphere is so rancid that I just want to give you an example. I wrote a column this week that was so boring that I can't even remember where it was. And I should have been ashamed, it was so boring. And I got this letter from somebody who must have felt, as Doug said, that I was a member of an unskilled trade. And she said this: do you sincerely believe your fellow Americans are stupid? Or do you just like to lie? How do you look yourself in the eye when you look in the mirror? I sincerely hope that you have no children or grandchildren, considering the state of the country you're leaving them and your egregious part in its destruction. May God have mercy on your eternal soul. That was her reaction to a column on the debt ceiling. So I'll leave you with that thesis. I never knew the debt ceiling was such an issue of such passion, and I'm glad to see that Americans at least are paying attention, or they're at least reading our columns. I'll let you take it from there, Peter.
Yeah, well, people get excited about the strangest things. And I think it's a valid point that you make too, that it's a mistake to hark back to some golden age that never really existed. I mean, we had Walter Duranty writing in the New York Times in the 1930s, misleading Americans about the nature of the famine in the USSR. You referred to, not by name, but to Hearst's yellow journalism, which led to the Spanish-American War. So, and then when you take away journalism, you insert the word media for journalism. And there's even worse disasters that have happened worldwide when you consider people like Joseph Goebbels, or like the use of radio in Rwanda for genocide. And that kind of leads me to another question, which is that it's not like, we live in the best of times and worst of times, right? We never had higher rates of literacy. We've never had greater technological progress. A call like this would have been unimaginable even 10 years ago. That said, people seem to, in so many cases, regress. I mean, we look at the international, look at the international, and Doug, you'll be very familiar with this, the international movement to end military rule in Myanmar. And it seems that, just as soon as that was over, the majority of the population there couldn't wait to gang up on the Rohingya. And with the same thing has happened all through Eastern Europe. The countries that you've all spoken about are countries that are nominally democracies, but that are seized with a nationalist fever or a strongman fever. Doug spoke about the salutary effects of citizen journalism, which is true. But at the same time, isn't there also a problem that everything is weighed is weighed the same way? Someone's musings, blog musings, are given the same importance as people like you who have been in the field for 30, 40 years. And of course, then there's the issue of media that is in journalism, broadly speaking, but that has a mission really to skew things. I think of Fox News. I think of some of the state broadcasters in a couple of the countries you mentioned, like Hungary. And the question is, how can we take out? How can we build on the best of what technology is providing us, and curb, limit, and push back these destructive excesses? So I don't know who wants to deal with that first, or if there's no answer to that.
I would say one thing here, that one of the criticisms of people like the three of us is that we are experienced journalists. Therefore, we're part of a international conspiracy, or that we are somehow corrupted. And I think that's from a misunderstanding. I think anyone in our families would tell us that we got into journalism because it's the profession in which you can ask difficult questions of your social betters. The notion that we are corporate beings, and that we dance to the tune of big money is lunacy. Nothing pleases the journalists I know more than to, and this is the phrase we all use, to afflict the comfort and to comfort the afflicted. And so, but we're under constant attack for our own experience, and it's really not much different apart from the notion that scientists are under attack because they are experts, and engineers are under attack because they are experts, and et cetera, et cetera. There is an attack not only on the credential but on the expert. Not to say that the three of us are experts. We kind of pride ourselves in being like the Platte River at its source, a mile wide and an inch deep. But I do think there's something to that.
I was just going to say, if I could, that I think that, at least in the United States, one of the chords that has been very effectively struck by the Trump takeover of the Republican Party has been a kind of sense that it's a zero-sum game, and there are these elites that look down on you, the public, and class distinctions or education gaps are then made to be a stand-in for all kinds of resentments. I would say, though, that American journalism, at least, is probably in an important phase of reflection about how well we represented a range of American views, not only those of what you might call the less educated or in some cases working class as opposed to aspiring middle class, but also how white American journalism has been disproportionately, and how unrepresentative of the range of ethnicities that make up the United States. And so I feel also humble about, the expertise and credential part also carries a kind of self-reflection burden. And Doug talked about the democratization of journalism. I mean, I do think the ability for anyone to raise questions or reach people is positive, but also, the standards of verifying information, that's what I would defend, that we're in a we're in a terrible situation because we don't seem to have accepted that there are standards for verifying information before it's thrown out in the ecosphere. So that's a little incoherent, but I'm both reflecting on it and worrying about it.
Thank you, Susan. You know, just to expand a bit on that, and to bring this back to the initial topic, which is journalists and human rights. And I think it's important to remember the right, I mean, aside from the right to life, which is the right to say anything. It's the right to the freedom of speech and the right to have a voice, and it's the right to be wrong. That's part of that. David listed, and he was quite right to do so, you know, the long history of incidents where reporters and commentators for major institutions have been wrong about things, and wrong on the front page, wrong about the threat of communism, wrong about Hitler, wrong about Saddam Hussein, things like that. And it's very important to realize that the rights we're protecting are not just the right to carefully report and do verified things, but to try your best and be wrong and be offensive and things like that. One of the most dangerous things is the rise of laws against fake news. And in fact, that's what Maria Ressa, the Filipina journalist who has just won the Nobel Peace Prize, was gotten on, was a law against fake news, because it meant that the nominally democratic but strongman authoritarian regime of Duterte in the Philippines could crack down on her for writing things that you and I would hope would regard as being true, but that the regime regarded as being fake because it embarrassed a friend of theirs, and so on. So we have to be very careful in protecting journalists to not try to outlaw being wrong. We should be vigorously active against propaganda campaigns launched by troll farms in St. Petersburg that through the 2016 election, or by groups of extremists who want to threaten the lives of journalists through letter campaigns or something like that. And we should do so by combating it using our craft, by using writing, by using our voice, by recognizing that our position as journalists does not come from some elite stature or from our years of experience or our salaries, but it comes from being good at it and being able to do it well and win the argument. If we fall into the trap of trying to outlaw being wrong or outlaw fake news or outlaw being offensive, then it's going to end up it's going to be one of those weapons that ends up pointed at us. It's like in any country where they allow people to carry handguns around to defend themselves, those handguns are used in a majority of cases by bad guys against the person holding the handgun. And a lot attempts to outlaw fake news and things like that, as Ms. Shira as the Filipina journalist discovered, will be used against you. So we need to recognize that the right is not just a right to be good, it's a right to be wrong or bad or offensive as well.
And I would say this, Susan and I are separated by only 3 or 4 years. We both were at the New York Times as very, very young reporters. And we were infused then, though I was the victim of a human rights violation there. And we were infused then with an idealism about our craft. And I often say this, and I bet you that Susan will endorse this. In nearly a half century, I have never witnessed nor be part of the production of a story, a paragraph, a sentence, a word, or a syllable that was knowingly put in the newspaper to be false. Now, some things turned out to be wrong, but never, not once, I can't think of one example where even a syllable, a word, was placed in the paper or on our websites, we knew it was false.
I think that's right. I mean, I know exactly what you're saying, Doug. I guess to me, part of the crisis is we've seen the harm. I'm not suggesting outlawing it, but we've really seen the harm that deliberate misinformation has done, life or death, a lot of the time. And, you know, so a lot of people are trying to think about news literacy or how to help people spot misinformation, which is another whole issue. And I do believe that there is a distinction between professional journalists and amateur or citizen. I mean, I don't know what the right term is. You know, there is a code that is there to do what David just eloquently said, which is that to the best of your ability, screen and believe that what you're printing is your best approximation of fair truth. You know, I mean, I think truth is a hard thing to achieve, at least your best reflection of the reality as you're able to see it and report it, knowing there are blinders. I mean, but I think the human rights part of it, which, you know, you mentioned, Doug, that I do think is important, is how many democratic governments, look, you know, governments have always hated the press for good reason, because the press is critical when it's doing its job. The press often, you know, in their eyes is unnecessarily hostile, unnecessarily negative, unnecessarily cynical. You could have a debate, but now that we see, I think the alarm is that this tool is proving so successful, both authoritarian governments that have really shut down. You know, I remember a time when people thought the internet meant that you couldn't suppress journalism. The internet meant that, you know, authoritarian regimes were doomed. That has not proven to be the case. And so I think the weapons that people have to suppress and distort the truth are something I worry about a lot.
Well, we also thought the television would be the principle, a great way to teach people how to speak French.
So listen, we've got about, I think about 20 minutes in the conversation left. It'd be great to hear some questions from folks who are tuning in, and one just came up. And that is, it's about Robert Kennedy Jr. and about the view on vaccines, his right to express his honest concerns regarding vaccines. So this is a broader question, it seems to me, about giving coverage to anti-vaxxers and covering them as a you know, an alternate point of view. I don't know how much of a human rights question that is, but if people want
it is a little bit, in the sense that we should all acknowledge that Mr. Kennedy and his supporters have the absolute right to express their completely fictional views about vaccination and so on. And it would be very dangerous of us to try to prevent them from saying that. On the other hand, it would be completely irresponsible of any self-respecting organization in broadcast or print to retail those views and to treat them as anything other than a sort of criminal phenomenon occurring in the background noise. I mean, it's very important to recognize that forms of extremism like this, including extreme views of public health measures that are very, very important, are to be looked at in reporting as extremist activities and criminal phenomena, not as normal parts of the political discourse. That doesn't mean they can't try as hard as they want. They can't stand on the street and say their things and so on. But no self-respecting outlet or publication should treat those as legitimate parts of the dialogue.
I mean, I just want to, you're not saying this is an actual criminal act, prosecutable. You're saying that—
No. We should never outlaw views or opinions, regardless how repugnant we find them, because it just gives them more attention. But we should be writing about it as ugly phenomenon going on out there, not as a legitimate political view that deserves equal weight with others. It's like there are political parties that are so extreme that we should not treat them like mainstream political parties, but as mob phenomena that are socially unacceptable.
Although, Doug, I understand what you're saying about crackpot theories on vaccines, but repugnant views, I mean, the US is my understanding, the only major democracy that doesn't have hate speech laws. So would you hold that view on hate speech laws as well? Which I think actually sort of work, at least in our context in Canada.
I would rather not use legal judicial means to combat hate speech. I would say that in the Canadian context, they work very well. I think my worry always about hate speech laws, and I don't know, David and Susan, whether you agree with this, is they really run the risk of elevating extremely fringe elements into being very much in the public eye, because by turning it into a hate speech trial or tribunal, it gets covered nationally and that sort of thing. So I think the benefits of having hate speech prosecution are often outweighed by the detriment of the way that those forms of laws. And I'm living in Germany now, which has used the outlying of the views that led to mass murder and genocide effectively to keep that from coming back. So I'm aware that this varies from country to country and society to society. But in countries like Canada and the United States, I do worry that trying to use the judicial heavy hand too much will give the veneer of credibility and attention to people who should simply be silenced by being ignored or countered in argument.
So can I pick up a little bit of a thread? I see there's a different question, but I guess that my slight unease, Doug, with part of I think journalists have really wrestled, particularly in the Trump era, with, how much attention do you give to extreme views if they're, for example, regularly enunciated by the president of the United States? And what do you do when people in power, officials are just promoting lies that are demonstrably lies? And so I know the New York Times wrestled with this a lot of American institutions wrestled with this. And so I'm not sure you can say blanket, you can't cover these things, because, I guess I'm still a believer that it's dangerous to ignore or suppress or not scrutinize hateful things. So I think it's a tough one. I think the American press learned painfully that they needed to be, to the mainstream press that I kind of belong to, that you needed to be able to say, so-and-so says this, but there's no scientific evidence, or there's absolutely no evidence. If you look at, as David referenced, January 6th, American news organizations that never would have done this before are now saying things like, Mr. Trump promulgates his false claims of election fraud. They just don't even caveat it. They just say it's false. It's demonstrably false because it's false. I think that was hard for a lot of institutions to do. And I think that's healthy.
Yeah. I think the American media had a very slow learning curve with the phenomenon of an extremist candidate and then an extremist president that the Europeans had learned a couple decades earlier with the practice they call the cordon sanitaire, which means that if there is a party of intolerance, a party of hatred that is gaining popularity, it's fundamental that no other political party shall ever work with it, and that the media does not treat it as being a normal part of politics. And I think you saw that in the major US papers early in 2016 and really 2017 and 2018, they continue to treat that Trump phenomenon as if it were just normal, one of the two political parties to be simply reported on. He said this, and of course what he says is often extraordinary lies and hateful things. But by 2019, and as you point out, the New York Times started to do this and so on, they would start to point out in the sentence where they quoted him that this was a lie. I mean, not a difference of opinion, not something that many would disagree with, but an empirical lie that could be proven by simple examination of facts. And I think it's a very important practice. I would not want it spread to other branches of politics. I would not, want normal politicians to have their quotes caveated that way. But I think it was an important development for the sort of forensic style of US news reporting to leave an opening to point out that something is a dangerous lie.
There's an interesting question about algorithms that has just come online, and I want to kind of build it into something a bit larger, which is that we're dealing with, mainstream media or traditional media that is increasingly starved of resources, where multitasking is an essential part of the job for every journalist who has to file online and print and video, and they're under-resourced and understaffed. And meanwhile, they seem to have less impact on a day-to-day life of people, because people go to other sources, most of which are not media, to get news, which, as we discussed, is often sketchier. How do we reverse that? How do we get to a situation where, if there's not at least a common public square of information, how does professional journalism get a leg up again and start clawing back some eyeballs and ears?
So that's really the question of the age. We've seen news staffs diminished by much as 2/3, or in some cases, some small papers, 9/10. We've seen the circulation of major newspapers, which had Sunday circulations of 800,000, now with Sunday circulations of about 90,000. We see the staffs of those papers commensurate shrinking. We've seen the tension between high hopes and low profits, or even worse than low profits. And if any of you two have the answer, I'd be happy to hear it. I think it's a huge crisis. There are now news deserts, places where there is no news. Simply is not because nothing's going on. It's because there's no one there to record it. We've really tested the question of if no one's here to hear a tree fall in the woods or a city council meeting be held. Did it really happen?
Our approach is like the Marshall Project, or like the cooperative that gave us the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers. Are they a potential answer?
I mean, I will plug a little bit. So the Marshall Project is part of what I think is a very exciting development in American journalism, which is the rise of a nonprofit newsroom, which is supported philanthropically. Primarily, the Marshall Project gets the lion's share of its money from philanthropists, a little bit from membership, but we're never going to be able to support ourselves the way New York Times can from digital subscriptions. And I think this has given rise, ProPublica, which is a great investigative reporting initiative. And, for example, when I look at reporting on criminal justice, which is what the Marshall Project focuses on, we've seen this all across localities in the United States where the local news organization has been gutted. And so criminal justice, like education, is quite local. The police commissioner is appointed by the mayor usually. The laws are state laws. Most people incarcerated are incarcerated in state prisons. So it really matters if no one's reporting. I mean, there's a city that I've spent some time in recently, in Ohio, where the news organization was gutted, and judges would tell me that there's no one assigned to courts as a beat, or there's no eye on it. So whatever abuses are going on, and you can be sure they're going on everywhere, are not reported. So I think that is really urgent, as David mentioned. I think nonprofit journalism can help. It depends on people's belief that journalism is worth civic support. But there are flourishing newsrooms because the for-profit model, particularly in localities, has been hard to sustain. Not impossible, but very hard.
Yeah, I mean, I get deeply disturbed when I hear about towns where everybody gets their news off Facebook and similar platforms, not because of what Facebook is or how that technology works. I mean, it's the dream that I think we all had as kids, you know, that someday we'd get away from people just reading the news once on their living room floor, and you'd have this thing where everything links to everything else and everything's live, and you get your news all day. It isn't the platform, it's the content. It's that what they're getting fed is garbage, and often false garbage. And it gets the point that something that I think we always kind of owed to our audience is more in the old days, was a recognition that news is not something that just exists and that waits to be reported or something like that. News exists because of reporting on it, right? Like the idea that there is a news story, it's just the random jumble of events in the world. Somebody who's a journalist has to go there and draw a square around some of the random events of the world and say, this is something worth noticing and drawing your attention to. News doesn't exist until there's reporting. And what fills that gap in content is often things with bad agendas, or things made up, or things by people who are trying to shift your allegiances in noxious ways. And so, yes, I think as Susan says, we need to focus on people who are creating content in interesting ways. It's not just professional journalists, it's talented people who are good at things. As you mentioned, things like ProPublica. I'd point out things like Bellingcat, the collection of technically sophisticated people who investigate things like atrocities by the Russians in Ukraine or by the Syrian regime using data techniques. I just visited a new project in Europe called Investigative Commons and so on, that brings together experts and non-experts to piece things together.
Hi, Masood.
I think it's important that we build new ways to create content to fill the things that are going to be in people's hands and on people's desks with things that are valuable, that are high quality, that are reliably high quality, so people go back to them because they've proven to be good and right before. Essentially, we're rebuilding the machine that existed in the newspaper and radio and TV days, but trying to rebuild that machine. We don't know how to do it as a revenue model completely yet, but I think we do know how to do it in terms of practice and creating content and to protect those rights.
So there's one interesting question here about what we can do to help ensure that young people coming up through the education system are given more critical analytical skills in which to consume news media. Organizations I'm involved in here in Canada, Civics and Journalists for Human Rights, both have received funding to implement programs like that. Is again where there seems to be disagreement generally in terms of what can be crammed into a school day. Is that a legitimate way to teach them to help people develop a more critical eye towards news consumption?
I would say emphatically yes. I'm sorry, David, did you?
No, I was going to be emphatically yes as well, Susan. But news literacy that term shouldn't exist about a decade ago. Now is an essential tool that people have to take to, I often ask students, how do you know that? Where did you learn that? And do you know that that's true? And did the person who told you that have any idea what he or she is talking about? And often the answer to the latter question is no. We sometimes don't know what we're talking about, but we go try to find out. That's the difference.
And I was also going to say, I think I was always very impressed years ago when one of my kids was applying to university. There was also a course offered on public, it's so prescient, but essentially like public health literacy in a weird way. In other words, like, when's a study legit? How to sort through, I think just the tools of analysis that should be part of a liberal education, because it doesn't even have to be only to newspapers. You can apply that to anything you absorb, from a scholarly paper to anything else. How do you verify what kind of sources do people rely on? I think they're just evidentiary literacy is important and probably could be integrated in the schools that have too much of a burden that's on top of many other demands.
I'm actually optimistic about the potential of the emerging generation to defend truth in journalism and things like that. I think I would like to see more education like that in classes. I remember I had a primary school teacher who had us, everyone in class, pick some ongoing news story and try to find contrasting views from various different newspapers on it. So I remember it dates me in that I chose the Gary Gilmore trial. But look it up someday. And but I think rather than sort of a formal civics education, I think a more generalized, and look, I can't complain if that happens, but a more generalized appreciation of being a critical consumer of information is useful. I'd say it's done more than we think in schools. And I think there's a lot of very positive data showing that people who are young now have more robust support for democracy and democratic values and institutions than people of my generation and previous generations did at the same age. That in most countries that is on the rise, and it's improving. Somehow, even though the media ecology is a very different place, that for those people of that age mostly involves things you hold in your hand and so on. I think critical thinking is not dying. I think we have problems with rights on the input end, on the content end, but I'm not worried about an audience of uncritical idiots being the problem. I'm much more worried about a world of malicious idiots creating content for people.
I'm not teaching at McGill. I teach at Carnegie Mellon here in Pittsburgh, and one of my class in March, when I'm back here in Pittsburgh, I'm going to be sending our students, and Carnegie Mellon students tend to be computer jocks and engineers. We're sending them out to cover, and they'll have no experience in covering anything. Sending out to cover a city council meeting or a school board meeting, and have them come back and see, number one, how hard it is, and number two, how what they report might be different from what someone else reports and why that is. And I think that exercise will be illuminating to them and to me as well.
This is an interesting, well, first of all, Doug, I see that not only were you inspired by that criminal case, so was Norman Mailer. That might account for your writing style. I don't know.
There you go.
But I mean, it's interesting. David spoke about the news deserts that have developed, and they've developed here in Canada too, as local newspapers have shut down. And yet, and it's coincided in the U.S. with what they call the nationalization of politics. It used to be, as Tip O'Neill said, all politics were local. Now all politics are national, and people don't. They migrate their national political views to their local politics, which also suffer from lack of coverage. Even here in Toronto, our great newspapers give very little coverage to city council compared to what goes on in Ottawa, where I used to work. Well, actually, I worked in both, but where the real life impact of what goes on in city council much more immediate than what happens in the nation's capital. It's the same in American cities. One of the projects, or most of the work that Journalists for Human Rights does in the developing world, is actually to help. I was in South Sudan and in Mali within the last couple of years, working on projects like this that actually help local reporters report on local news, things that we would consider mundane, like garbage pickup or the price of cooking oil, but which actually are human rights issues in these countries, and relevant news to people's daily lives. And again, we seem to have veered away from that. I
think Peter, this is a very important thing, because I think a lot of what we do focuses on national regimes and things like that. But there's a real risk at the local level of a loss of accountability. I mean, I've always had a theory that politics tends to get less democratic as it becomes more local, for a number of reasons. But one of the big reasons is that there are fewer people watching and monitoring it. So most people can name the prime minister and their governor or premier. Some can name their member of parliament. Very few can name their city councilor. And when you can't name somebody, it means you don't know what they're doing. And I think building up a culture of actual reporting, and the thing to train people is that the way you report on local issues is not as an expert. It's an area where actually expertise works against you, where conventional city hall reporting is a bunch of acronyms and names that the readers don't know. What I always tell people when I do journalism seminars is report on City Hall like it's the Beijing Bureau. Assume that 99% of your readers don't know who the mayor is and don't even know what the city council is or anything, and explain it all as if you've come from Mars. And that's one of the flaws in this new ecology of information sources, is not that it's too simplistic, it's that it's too insiderish and too partisan in many cases, and things like this. I think a call for a return to naivete and simplicity in reporting can help people a lot, and would help build up trust, I think, in people doing reporting as well, whether they're professional journalists or citizens making a go of it.
I mean, isn't that true? So many people read political coverage now because they're interested in politics, not because it's their civic responsibility to know about stuff, because we write it like it's a game. We write it where the elections are the most important events, not governing. And so we make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think it's about time for us to wind down. I just want to, before we do, there were glimmers of hope. There were threads of sunlight throughout this discussion. And I think it's important to capture those. I think it's important to, you talked about, Doug, about how positive you feel about the upcoming generation in terms of their rigor and their critical analysis skills. I mean, Susan, in terms of the stories that your unit at the New York Times reported on with Weinstein and sexual harassment, unthinkable even 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. This notion of, I think there's been an expanding notion of people's rights, at least in our countries. And that's what some of the pushback is actually about. But there has been an expanding notion of rights, which is, I guess, a positive development. But I want to ask each of you just to kind of give the audience a brief, the final words that are a little more on what you look forward to side.
Well, I'll start. I've hired about 120 interns in my time. I'm semi-retired now from the newspaper. I'm retired from the newspaper, of the 100, I would say 98 of them are going to be fabulous journalists. They have the idealism and the sense of purpose that I know that Susan and I had when we were colleagues as very young reporters. They have terrific instincts. They have great senses of humor. And I don't care what anybody says about millennials. I think they're fabulous. And the work they're going to do is going to ennoble us all. I'd say that without reservation.
Okay. Susan.
I would echo David. I'm excited. I see a lot of young journalists, and I'm excited that it's been a tough slog for journalists. I actually have a child who's gone into journalism, and all these friends said to me, "How could you allow your child to do this?" And I'm like, "Why? It's the greatest job in the world." I'm a big believer in the ultimate power of journalism. And I am excited that I think journalism being forced to open up in certain ways, to constantly examine itself, to ask who writes about whom and for whom. I think there are a lot of really important questions to be pondered about that. And so I do think that, and journalism is still making change. It's making change. We saw it. I'm going to give all credit to my colleagues. I didn't actually report the Harvey Weinstein story. It was part of a group of stories. And, we see a sea change that helped to set off a movement. And I see it in a smaller way at the Marshall Project, where, we're reported out about an abuse and a law gets changed. Little by little, it still matters. I believe in that.
Doug.
I would say, all I could say optimistically is we need to have faith that the bad guys are not going to win. They're not going to win in the long run. There are a lot of places in the world right now that are going through dark times at the moment. I mean, some of the stories we've been talking about illustrate that. Sometimes it takes a long time. But the fact is, when they try to crush somebody who is telling the truth, nobody buys it in the long run. So one of the most useful things anybody ever said to me about writing newspaper columns and things like that was in any part of life, whether it's with your kids or your spouse or your readers, you never win an argument while you're having the argument. Nobody ever, what you're facing and shouting at each other, nobody ever says, yeah, you're right, I was wrong, and walks away. You win the argument 2 weeks later, when you suddenly realize that person is using all your points and is using them. And in some cases, it's longer time. And sometimes it takes a much longer time to win the argument. But you need to recognize that if you are putting a reality that people feel and that you report carefully and accurately and in a humble way that acknowledges that you're not a monolithic voice of truth, but that shows where you show your work and you're careful, that in the long run, that is going to win out over lies and hate and things like that, because people are not becoming less literate or less intelligent or less critical thinking. They're becoming more so as new generations emerge, like we were saying. And we've got to recognize that in the long run, the bad guys are not going to win here. We recognize that these are rights, and that they're worth fighting for, and that it's worth preserving the memory of the people who've lost that battle.
Great. Well, on that upbeat note, I'm handing it back to Debbie. Thank you, panelists, for I think it was really interesting and very positive and constructive discussion.
Well, more than interesting, I think this has been an incredible event. So many issues have been highlighted and discussed, and you all have been wonderful. We really appreciate all of you, your esteemed panelists and our moderator, for donating your time today to participate in this discussion. You've succeeded in bringing the challenges of journalism to the forefront for all of us. Thank you to the corporate sponsors, the Globe and Mail, Daniel Martin from the Martin Group of Scotia Wealth Management, the Rael Wallenberg Center, and our marketers, Women Ambassadors Forum. Your participation enabled us to present this very high caliber event today, beyond my imagination. Please be aware that today's discussion has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube site that is found on our website.